Hello friends. This is a first-person collection of 4 true road trip stories, each one told by someone who lived it and couldn't shake it. These are not fiction. They are personal accounts from people who hit the road and found something waiting in the dark. If you like slow burn dread, tense discoveries, and endings that haunt, you'll want to listen closely. Turn off the lights, put on headphones, and let's begin. Story 1. I was 23, and my friend Rachel and I were on our way back from a music festival. We had driven past midnight, the highway thin and silver beneath our headlights. The radio had gone silent, not because we turned it off, but because the static had overtaken the station and the songs went away like a memory. We joked about ghosts, about flat tires, and the kind of things people say at 3 in the morning to keep each other's nerves steady. The freeway cut through 2 states, long stretches where cell service was a rumor. I remember the sky, a blanket of ink with a single, stubborn moon. We alternated driving, and after an hour Rachel said she needed to rest. She dozed in the passenger seat while I kept my eyes on the ribbon of road. Somewhere past a forgotten exit, we passed a mile marker. The numbers glowed dimly. I remember thinking that the marker's number was oddly familiar, like something I'd seen earlier on a map, though I couldn't place it. Minutes later, I glanced at the odometer and realized we'd miscalculated distance. We had assumed we'd already passed the town where we planned to stop. My phone showed no bars. I spotted a small pullout with a broken sign and an old lamppost that hummed with a tired light. I slowed, thinking we could rest or check directions, and as we did, the car ahead of us, a pickup with a camper, eased past and vanished into the dark. I watched it fade like a swallowed thing. We parked at the pullout and stepped out to stretch. The air smelled like hot rubber and dust. The world felt larger, as if there were more room for strange things to hide. Rachel was the first to notice the mile marker. It sat at the side of the road, its number clean and unweathered. "This can't be right," she said. The number on the marker was the same as the one we'd passed. Not similar, exactly the same. We both stared. It was a ridiculous, impossible smallness of detail until the hair along my arms stood up. The pullout's lamplight flickered, and in that flicker a shadow moved, a shadow that belonged to no car or man or tree. It was tall and bent in odd angles. I walked to the marker and ran my fingers along its face. The paint was fresh, the post had no rust. I remember thinking of all the markers I've seen that fall to time and weather. This one looked like it had been placed minutes ago. Rachel, behind me, began to whisper about someone watching. I laughed at her then, because the rational part of me wanted to keep pretending we were safe. We decided to keep moving. I started the engine and floored it, wanting to put distance between us and the impossible marker. The road swallowed our taillights. We drove for 10 minutes, then 20. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The highway had subtly altered. The map on my phone tried to redraw itself and failed. Then, ahead, the same pickup we had watched earlier was stopped in the middle lane, its hazard lights on. I slowed and drifted to the shoulder. As we passed, the driver, a man with a beard and a hat, turned his head toward us. He stared with a blank expression, as if he had been carved from highway tar and left in the wind. We thought about offering help, but as soon as we considered it, our headlights caught something else. The same lamppost and pullout we had just left, complete with the fresh mile marker, only this time there was no car in the pullout behind us. We had looped, or worse, and the world had copied and pasted a small corner of itself. Rachel began to cry quietly. Her fingers found my hand and squeezed with a desperation I still feel when I think of that night. We kept driving, faster than before, and the highway stretched and contracted like a living thing. Each mile marker we passed had the same numbering sequence, matching the numbers we'd already seen. Time felt sticky. At one point our headlights illuminated a figure standing on the centerline, a woman in white, her hair long and dark, pressed against the stars. She bowed her head as if in mourning. We swerved around her, and when we looked back she was gone, as though she had never existed on the asphalt. The pickup vanished. The pullout reappeared where no pullout should be. Our phones regained service suddenly, all at once, and messages from hours before flooded the screen like a forgotten tide. We pulled into the next small town at dawn, hands shaking, admitting to one another that we'd seen something that wasn't explainable. We learned later that drivers in that area sometimes reported loops, stretches of highway where compasses spun and people swore their cars had been turned back by some force. We left before sunrise and never went back. Even now, years later, if I find myself on a dark road at night, I watch mile markers go by one and I count. I count so I can make sure I am moving forward and not repeating the same mile. After the festival, we were exhausted and buzzing, the kind of tired that makes the edges of the world soft. Rachel was full of stories about the band, about how the drummer kept missing cues and smiling like it was all part of the show. I remember the small arguments we had that night over everything and nothing, which route would be faster, whether to stop for coffee, whether to sleep at a roadside motel or keep going. The festival had left us with a sticky bag of souvenirs, a flyer for another upcoming event, a paper wristband that had bled color in the rain, and a sense of being still young enough to make risky decisions. When we stopped at the pullout, I noticed things I hadn't noticed at first. A child's tricycle half buried in brush, a length of rope looped over a low fence post, and a set of tire tracks that led off the shoulder into the scrub. We took pictures because we always took pictures, even then, out of habit. Rachel joked that we'd made the Ghost Hunters blog post of the month. I saved the images to my phone, but when we tried to show them to our friends later the photos were blurred, smoky smudges where a clear image should have been. I still have one of those photos, and if you look closely you can make out something that looks like a face where it shouldn't be. That night, in the motel, we slept in the same room because we didn't want to be alone. We left early and stopped at a diner for breakfast. The waitress who served us looked at us like she had seen us before. "You two look like you've driven through the loop," she said. We told her we'd just been to the festival, and she didn't press it further. She wrote down a number for the sheriff, though, and when we called the office later they were polite but formal. "We know of the area," the deputy said. "We advise people to avoid it at night. Some folks report getting turned around. We can't explain it. Keep to the main road." For weeks after, I would wake in the middle of the night with a mouthful of dust, the smell of the lamppost in my nostrils. We stopped taking the long way on trips. Rachel moved, first across town and then out of state, and the last I heard she still counted mile markers on late-night drives. The memory hasn't faded, it's a small, sharp thing that's part of me now. Story 2. I was alone on a cross-country drive, 22 hours of music, coffee, and the highway. The plan was simple: get from point A to point B, deliver my things, and begin a new job. I had an old sedan with a sagging passenger seat, a stack of paper maps on the dash, and a playlist of songs that now feel like relics. It was around 2 in the morning when I saw him, a figure standing under the glow of a distant sign, thumb raised in the old-fashioned gesture of someone who needed a ride. Normally I would have driven on. You hear the warnings about picking up hitchhikers. But he looked tired and wet, and the stretch of road had no services for miles. He was bundled in a coat that looked too thin for the cold. Something about his posture said exhaustion, not menace. I slowed and pulled over. He climbed into the car without a word. We drove for a while in silence. His breath fogged on the window. Every now and then he'd glance at me with a gaze that made me feel like the last person on earth. He carried a small duffel with a stray zipper and a smell of salt. It reminded me, oddly, of the sea. He asked for the next town and said he needed a bus ticket. We had cordial small talk. He told me his name was Mark. He used words like fault line and rest stop in a way that made me think he might be someone who had been on the road a while. About 30 minutes later I realized we had passed the rest stop where he had wanted to get off. I apologized and pulled into the next exit. As I turned the car into the parking area, I glanced at the back seat and his duffel and felt my stomach drop. The jacket on the seat was visibly older than the coat he'd been wearing. The duffel zipper was fully closed. There was no sign that anyone had been sitting in the front passenger seat. No indent in the cushion. No stray hair. The radio was playing a station I didn't remember tuning into. I suddenly became aware of small things. The cup holders had a ring of old coffee stains I hadn't noticed before. A receipt for a gas station I hadn't been to was on the floor. I turned to look for him and the seat behind me was empty. I checked the windows. The parking lot was nearly deserted. I found a coffee shop that was still open. Inside, The barista listened to me when I told him about the hitchhiker. He nodded with the sort of expression people give when they have their own story to keep. "You didn't pick anyone up, friend," he said. "You drove past a man out on the highway last night. We called the highway patrol. They found him in the ditch a mile down the road. He'd been there for days. We read his name off an old badge. He matched old reports. You must have given him a ride in some way, but when we went to look, the car was empty. Sometimes that's what happens when the dead need to go somewhere." I tried to find records of the man later and learned nothing concrete. The parking lot surveillance footage from the coffee shop was missing several minutes, replaced with fuzzy static. I remember the way my hands trembled as I gripped the steering wheel after that, the desperate gratitude that someone might have found a little mercy, even for a stranger who might have already been gone. To this day, I don't know whether I was the one who did a kindness, or whether I'd been given a warning. I still leave space in my car for the idea that sometimes the road is a place where the living and the dead briefly share the same lane. After the night I picked up Mark, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd violated some unspoken rule. I returned to the gas station the next day and asked if they'd seen anything unusual. The manager had a hollowness around his eyes like he hadn't slept in days. He told me the highway patrol had pulled a man from the ditch near the same sign the night before. He'd been there a while, the manager said. "We called it in. They came and took pictures. Found his ID in his pocket. But then folks started saying he used to hitch rides from here." Kids nodded like they'd known him in stories. I checked the patrol reports and the local paper's archives for weeks. I called morgues, libraries. None of it matched my memory of the license or the face. When I spoke to friends about it, some of them told me I must have been dreaming. One offered, half joking, that stress can do strange tricks on your mind. I kept a journal after that, a small notebook tucked in the glove compartment. I wrote down the time, the smell, the thing he'd said about the dog, and the way his thumb had scraped the edge of the door when he climbed in. Months later, flipping through that journal, I found a page I'd not written. In cramped handwriting, it read, "You gave him a ride." He smiled. "You drove away." It was in my handwriting, and I'd never written it. My explanation has always been that the road took an impression of me and made it into a thing I could hold. Today, if I see someone standing alone on the shoulder, I try to look away. But sometimes I'll slow just a little and wonder, did I leave someone behind? Did I do something that felt compassionate in the throat of the dark? There's no answer. There's only a memory that smells faintly of diesel and sea salt, and a cup of coffee gone cold in a hands-free cup holder. Story 3. A friend of mine, Jason, is not a person given to embellishment. He calls things like he sees them, and he once worked nights as a long-haul driver. He told me this story in pieces over many months between beers, each time with his voice getting quieter toward the end. He was driving through a stretch of desert that had been carved by wind and hard light. The kind of place where towns appear on maps like ornaments, small dots waiting to be rubbed away by time. It was late, and the only lights were those he carried in the cab. His rig hummed. A storm had been predicted but had not yet arrived. The air felt charged. Jason reached into his console and flipped through the AM stations because he liked the way they sounded in the dead of night. Static, announcers with tired voices, sometimes a late-night caller. Then a voice he knew, unmistakably his own, came through the speakers, saying his name slowly, like someone who had all night to say it. "Jason," the voice said, perfectly clear. "Jason, you should stop." He laughed at first, because the idea of his own voice on the radio felt like a prank. He recorded himself for proof, but when he played it back there was no such recording. The voice returned, and it wasn't just his name. The radio began to describe his trip in small, precise details, the color of the cap he wore, the place he'd left an old paper map on the seat, the name of his ex-partner's dog. It knew the kind of coffee he drank and how he liked it. Jason stopped the truck at a lonely roadside motel and went inside with a gun in his belt, feeling foolish and a little frightened. The clerk at the motel seemed to know more than she should. "You'd best be careful out there, hun," she said. "This road takes what it wants." She told him to park under the lamp and to lock the doors. When he returned to his rig, the radio was playing the same low loop, and this time someone, a caller or a voice from nowhere, whispered an address. Jason, stubborn as he is, didn't drive away. He kept the rig till dawn, and when the sun touched the horizon he went back to the address the radio had whispered. There, in a small clearing by an abandoned rest stop, he found a skeleton of a car wrapped around a tree, its paint long gone and a faded name on the license plate. He never matched the car to a report. There were no missing person flyers. The police were polite but uninterested. Jason believes the radio gave him a choice, to keep going or to stop and not drive that night. Which of those choices saved him, he never knew, but he stopped choosing the AM stations after that. Once, when I asked him if he had been tempted to speak back into the radio, he looked at me like I was mad. "You don't speak into a thing that knows you," he said. "You let it say what it wants and then you go someplace with light." A friend of mine, Jason, is not a person given to embellishment. He calls things like he sees them, and he once worked nights as a long-haul driver. He told me this story in pieces over many months between beers, each time with his voice getting quieter toward the end. He was driving through a stretch of desert that had been carved by wind and hard light. The kind of place where towns appear on maps like ornaments, small dots waiting to be rubbed away by time. It was late, and the only lights were those he carried in the cab. His rig hummed. A storm had been predicted but had not yet arrived. The air felt charged. Jason reached into his console and flipped through the AM stations because he liked the way they sounded in the dead of night. Static, announcers with tired voices, sometimes a late-night caller. Then a voice he knew, unmistakably his own, came through the speakers, saying his name slowly, like someone who had all night to say it. "Jason," the voice said, perfectly clear. "Jason, you should stop." He laughed at first, because the idea of his own voice on the radio felt like a prank. He recorded himself for proof, but when he played it back there was no such recording. The voice returned, and it wasn't just his name. The radio began to describe his trip in small, precise details: the color of the cap he wore, the place he'd left an old paper map on the seat, the name of his ex-partner's dog. It knew the kind of coffee he drank and how he liked it. Jason stopped the truck at a lonely roadside motel and went inside with a gun in his belt, feeling foolish and a little frightened. The clerk at the motel seemed to know more than she should. "You'd best be careful out there, hun," she said. "This road takes what it wants." She told him to park under the lamp and to lock the doors. When he returned to his rig, the radio was playing the same low loop, and this time someone, a caller or a voice from nowhere, whispered an address. Jason, stubborn as he is, didn't drive away. He kept the rig till dawn, and when the sun touched the horizon he went back to the address the radio had whispered. There, in a small clearing by an abandoned rest stop, he found a skeleton of a car wrapped around a tree, its paint long gone and a faded name on the license plate. He never matched the car to a report. There were no missing person flyers. The police were polite but uninterested. Jason believes the radio gave him a choice, to keep going or to stop and not drive that night. Which of those choices saved him, he never knew, but he stopped choosing the AM stations after that. Once, when I asked him if he had been tempted to speak back into the radio, he looked at me like I was mad. "You don't speak into a thing that knows you," he said. "You let it say what it wants and then you go someplace with light." After the radio incident he took on fewer night runs. He said the thing with the voice changed how he listened to the world. Whereas before he'd listen for rhythms in engines and the low hum of tires, he now listened for things aloud that came from other people's mouths. The soft talk of concession stand owners at dawn, the words of truck stop clerks swapping gossip in the light, and the distant, half-remembered radio voices that once made him feel less alone. He did keep a cassette recorder in his glove box for a while, but when he played the recordings back the voice wasn't there. Once, on a long run, he tuned to the AM band and heard someone call his ex-partner's name across 10 states. Jason pulled off the road and sat with his hands off the wheel until the sun came up. He said he didn't feel protected anymore by the solitude of night. He felt exposed to some audience with no seats. Years later, Jason quit driving long haul. He now teaches at a vocational school and comes by sometimes to tell the same story the same way, warning the wide-eyed students not to trust a radio that knows too much. "Let it be white noise," he told them. "If it tries to play the parts of you don't remember, stop the truck and get out to breathe." Story 4. The last story comes from a married couple, Leah and Marcus, who had been working remotely for months and decided to take their camper van on a weekend trip. They wanted silence and the slow pace of small towns. They followed the GPS and the open sky until the road narrowed and trees leaned in as if eavesdropping. It was late when Marcus, who was driving, missed the exit they planned to take. He cursed softly, knowing they'd have to loop. But when he followed the signs for the next exit and turned, he found an empty stretch of country road with an old stone marker and an arch of trees. It seemed like a scenic route. He slowed. They were tired and wanted only the safety of a site where they could park and rest. As they drove, the trees thickened and the radio faded to nothing. The GPS pulsed but refused to reroute. Moonlight poured through the treetops and painted bands on their faces. Leah, in the passenger seat, claimed she saw someone standing under a tree, a man in a hat who seemed to watch the van as it drifted by. Marcus glanced over and saw nothing. Leah insisted, and they argued for a few minutes until the road rolled into a clearing. In the clearing there was a small service station, closed and decayed, with an old pump and a faded sign. A single car sat idling at the pump, its lights on. Its driver read the paper under a lamplight and did not look up. Marcus parked, and they went inside to use the bathroom. The interior smelled like old coffee and the pages of magazines. On the wall, a framed photograph showed the station as it had been years ago, a snapshot of a family laughing in front of a truck. The picture's date was from decades ago. In the frame, there was a small blur near the edge, as if someone had been caught mid-motion. Leah pointed to it and said she had seen that same blur sketching the tree line outside. They laughed, a fragile, nervous sound. When they re-entered the van, they found a note tucked under the windshield wiper. The handwriting was impatient and the words brief, "Do not take the next left." They assumed it must have been from a concerned local. Marcus, stubborn, took the left anyway. The road narrowed and twisted until it felt like the trees had been planted close enough to whisper. They drove past mile markers that counted backward. The van's headlights threw long shadows. A dog began to bark in the distance, an odd, high sound that made Leah grip Marcus's arm. There were no houses, though, just empty fields and a sky full of indifferent stars. Then the engine stuttered and died. Marcus tried to start it and nothing happened. He popped the hood and they stood together in the night, breathing into the cold. From the trees came a smell like damp earth and old leaves. Leah swore she saw movement among the trees, close to the road. They walked back to the van and found prints in the soft shoulder, not human prints, but booted tracks leading away into the dark, and between them a set of small, delicate marks like the tread of a child's shoe. They walked to the service station to seek help. The pump still had light on, but when they opened the door a bell clanged as if disturbed. The place was empty. The newspaper rack was filled with papers the date of which didn't match the day they had traveled. On the counter was a small child's shoe, one of those rubber-soled sandals, placed perfectly upright. Leah's stomach dropped. "We should leave," she whispered. Marcus, unnerved, tried the van again. It turned over, as if nothing had happened. They drove out of the clearing at a speed that felt like flight. Mile markers resumed counting forward, and the GPS returned to life. The next town's lights appeared on the horizon. When they pulled into the safety of a motel, exhausted and refusing to speak, Marcus checked the van more carefully. Under the hood he found a single scrap of paper folded into a triangle. Inside was a child's drawing, a crude sketch of a house with stick figures and trees, and at the bottom a single word, "Stay." They left the next morning and later learned, from locals, that the road they had turned down had been decommissioned decades ago after a sinkhole opened and swallowed a stretch of pavement during a heavy storm. Families were affected. A child was reported missing in the search that followed. The station had closed soon after. Some nights, the locals say, people still take that scenic route and find themselves walking in circles or seeing the same pump lit up when there's no electricity for miles. Leah and Marcus didn't talk about the incident for weeks. When they did, it was in small fragments. Leah would say, "Do you remember the shoe?" And Marcus would say, "Do you remember the note?" They bought a small camera and tried to take pictures of the station, which had been cleaned up since their drive-through, But when they developed the photos, the images were always overexposed in the same corner where the shoe appeared on the counter. They eventually drove the route again during daylight, convincing themselves that daylight and numbers would fix memory. The arch of trees looked ordinary, the pump was empty and rusted. When they asked locals, the story drifted into rumor, whispers about a sinkhole and a missing child, the station that closed, the van that slipped and died. Some people told them they ought not to go back, that certain stretches keep echoes. At night, when Leah wakes, she can smell oil and hears a faint tapping like a small shoe against a license plate. Marcus, who once loved the quiet of empty roads, now keeps the map app open and zoomed. They still take drives, but they avoid unnamed exits and scenic loops. For them, the road itself keeps a memory and occasionally presses it into the present. Thank you for sitting with me through these 4 true road trip stories. I know they are heavy. If you want more, the next episode will feature accounts of travelers who found themselves on quiet bridges and bridges that refused to be crossed. Follow the channel and leave a comment if you want your story heard. If you like the voice you heard tonight, consider supporting the channel so I can keep producing long-form collections. Until then, keep your lights on, trust your instincts, and if an exit sign starts to look familiar in a place it shouldn't, keep moving. Drive safely. P.S. A small note before you go. Roads are like old books, cracked spines and margins full of tiny annotations. Every traveler writes something into the night, an accidental sentence of breath and tire. Sometimes those sentences are kind, sometimes they are warnings. If you ever see a marker that keeps repeating, or hear a voice that knows your name, treat it like a sentence you did not write. Mark the moment, tell someone, and keep driving toward the light. The stories shared here are the margin notes of other people's nights. Respect them, and respect the quiet that follows. Stay safe.